There's a moment that lives in the throat of almost every person who has learned to keep the peace. It happens in the space between wanting to speak and choosing not to. It's the quiet swallow of words that were almost said, the slight nod when you meant to shake your head, the soft, "it's fine" that leaves your mouth even though everything inside you knows it isn't fine at all. You've felt this moment, perhaps more times than you can count. That small, familiar sensation of folding yourself inward, of choosing silence over the possibility of friction, of placing someone else's comfort above your own truth. And at first, it might not seem like much, just a small accommodation, a tiny surrender. But over time, these moments begin to form a pattern, a way of moving through the world that shapes not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. If you've ever noticed this pattern in your own life, if you've ever wondered why speaking up feels so difficult even when you know you should, if you've ever said yes when every fibre of your being wanted to say no, you're not alone in this experience. And tonight, as you settle into rest, we're going to explore this together, gently, without judgment, because there's so much more to understand about the quiet art of pleasing everyone but yourself, and what it costs us when we do. Now, dim those lights, get cozy, settle into your pillow, and let yourself relax. Take a breath. Perhaps it starts as a tightening in your chest, a slight constriction that makes your next breath feel shallower than the one before. You're standing in a conversation where someone has just asked you for something, maybe your time, maybe your energy, maybe a favour that will cost you more than they realise. And before your mind can even fully process the request, your mouth is already forming the word yes. It's automatic, this response. So practiced that it bypasses thought entirely and goes straight from their question to your compliance. You've felt this, haven't you? The way your body moves into agreement before your brain has a chance to consider what you actually want, what you actually need, what saying yes will actually mean for the life you're trying to live. This architecture of accommodation, this structure you've built inside yourself, wasn't constructed all at once. It was laid brick by brick, moment by moment, choice by choice, until it became so solid you forgot you were the one who built it. You learned, somewhere along the way, that your needs could wait, that other people's comfort mattered more than your own truth, that peace, even false peace, was worth the price of your silence. And now, years later, you find yourself standing in that same pattern, watching yourself say yes when you mean no, watching yourself smile when you want to scream, watching yourself accommodate when what you really need is to set a boundary so clear it leaves no room for misinterpretation. The pattern shows up everywhere once you start to see it. In the text messages you respond to immediately even when you're exhausted, in the plans you agree to even though you'd rather stay home, in the opinions you keep to yourself because voicing them might cause discomfort, in the way you apologise for things that aren't your fault, for needing things, for taking up space, for existing in a way that might inconvenience someone else. It's woven into the fabric of your daily life so thoroughly that you don't even notice you're doing it anymore. It's just who you are, the accommodating one, the flexible one, the one who makes everything easier for everyone else. But here's what happens in that space between their ask and your yes. In that fraction of a second before you agree, there's a moment where your authentic response tries to surface. It might be a quiet no. It might be a hesitation. It might be a feeling in your body that says, this doesn't feel right. This is too much. I don't want to do this. But you've trained yourself not to listen to that voice. You've learned to override it so quickly that sometimes you don't even hear it anymore. You've become fluent in the language of self-abandonment, so practiced at it that it feels like breathing. And what gets lost in that moment, what disappears in that automatic yes, is you, your actual preference, your genuine desire, your real limit. The cost of this pattern accumulates slowly, so gradually that you might not notice it at first. But over time, you start to feel it. A heaviness in your chest that won't quite lift. A resentment that builds quietly beneath your helpful exterior. An exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix because it's not your body that's tired. It's your soul, weary from the constant effort of being what everyone else needs, while never quite being what you need for yourself. You start to lose track of where your boundaries are supposed to be, if you ever had them at all. You start to feel less like a person with preferences and more like a service, available to whoever needs you whenever they need you, regardless of what it costs you to show up. And so the pattern continues, reinforcing itself with every yes you don't mean, with every boundary you don't set, with every moment you choose someone else's comfort over your own truth. It becomes the foundation of your relationships, the structure of your identity, the way you've learned to earn love by making yourself useful, by being easy, by never causing problems, by disappearing just enough that everyone else can be more comfortable. There's a memory buried somewhere in your childhood, though you might not be able to point to it exactly. It lives in the feeling more than the facts. A moment when you learned, perhaps without anyone ever saying it directly, that your worth was conditional, that love came with requirements, that being good meant being easy, being helpful, being whatever someone else needed you to be in that particular moment. Psychologist John Bowlby spent decades studying attachment theory, the way early relationships shape our sense of safety in the world, and what he found was that children don't just need love, they need predictable love, consistent love, love that doesn't depend on perfect behavior or constant accommodation. But maybe that's not what you experienced. Maybe you grew up in a home where love felt conditional, where you had to earn affection through good behavior, where your emotional needs were seen as burdensome, where expressing anger or disappointment meant withdrawal or punishment. Maybe you learned early that the way to stay safe, the way to stay loved, was to be small, to be quiet, to need as little as possible while giving as much as you could. That lesson, learned so young, becomes the blueprint for every relationship that follows. It shapes how you show up in friendships, in romantic partnerships, in professional settings, in every interaction where connection is at stake. Children are incredibly perceptive. They read emotional atmospheres with a precision that most adults have forgotten. And when a child senses that their needs create stress, that their emotions are too big, that their presence is conditional on their helpfulness, they adapt. They learn to read the room, to anticipate what's needed, to shape themselves into whatever version will keep the peace, keep the love, keep themselves safe. This isn't a conscious choice. It's survival. It's the intelligence of a young nervous system figuring out how to navigate an environment that doesn't feel consistently secure. Attachment researchers talk about something called anxious attachment, a pattern that develops when a child's needs are met inconsistently, when they can't predict whether reaching out will result in comfort or rejection. These children grow into adults who are hyper-vigilant to other people's emotional states, who work hard to maintain connection, who often become people-pleasers because they've learned that love is something you have to earn, something you can lose if you're not careful, something that requires constant effort to maintain. They didn't choose this pattern. They inherited it from relationships that taught them their worth was negotiable, that their needs were secondary, that their job was to manage other people's feelings while minimizing their own. And here's what makes this pattern so persistent. It worked. It kept you safe when you were small and couldn't keep yourself safe. It earned you whatever version of love was available. It helped you navigate relationships that might have been more painful without it. So your nervous system holds on to it, keeps deploying it, keeps returning to it even decades after the original situation has passed. Because from your nervous system's perspective, if it worked once, if it kept you from abandonment or rejection or anger or withdrawal, then it's worth keeping, even if it costs you everything, even if it means abandoning yourself to avoid being abandoned by others. The tragedy is that the coping mechanism that protected you as a child becomes the prison that confines you as an adult. The strategy that helped you survive becomes the pattern that keeps you from truly living, because now you're not a child without options. You're an adult with the capacity to choose differently, to set boundaries, to voice your needs, to walk away from relationships that require you to disappear. But the pattern doesn't know that. It still operates from that old fear, that old belief that your worth is conditional, that love must be earned through accommodation, that speaking up will result in abandonment. When you say yes to something you want to decline, there's a fear operating underneath that agreement, so quiet you might not even hear it consciously. It whispers in a voice that sounds reasonable, almost protective. It says, if you disappoint them, they'll leave. If you set a boundary, they'll think you're selfish. If you prioritize yourself, you'll be alone. And so the yes comes not from desire but from terror, a small act of self-abandonment disguised as generosity. You've learned to mistake your own self-erasure for kindness, your silence for diplomacy, your exhaustion for virtue. But kindness that costs you your peace isn't kindness at all, it's self-betrayal wrapped in a smile. This fear has roots that go deeper than logic. It's not a thought you can simply reason away. It's a belief held in your body, in your nervous system, in the part of you that learned long ago that being difficult meant being disposable. That belief shows up as physical sensation, the tightening in your chest when you consider saying no, the nausea that rises when you think about disappointing someone, the panic that floods your system when you imagine someone being angry at you. These aren't just thoughts, they're somatic memories, your body remembering what happened or what you feared would happen when you couldn't be what someone else needed. Researchers who study the neurobiology of people-pleasing have found that for many people, the anticipation of rejection activates the same brain regions that light up during physical pain. Your nervous system literally experiences the threat of disappointing someone as a threat to your survival, which means that every time you say no, every time you set a boundary, every time you prioritize your own needs, you're not just making a simple choice. You're overriding a deeply embedded alarm system that's convinced your safety depends on your compliance. That's why it feels so hard. That's why it takes so much courage. Because you're not just changing behavior, you're rewiring fear. And that fear is reinforced every time you avoid conflict and nothing bad happens. Every time you say yes and someone stays, every time you accommodate and the relationship continues, your nervous system marks it as evidence that the strategy works. It doesn't notice what you're losing in the process, the resentment building, the self-respect eroding, the authenticity fading. It only notices that you didn't get abandoned, that the person didn't leave, that the peace was kept. And so the pattern continues, validated by the very outcome it creates, a false peace purchased at the price of your true self. But what if the fear is wrong? What if the catastrophe you're trying to prevent by constantly accommodating isn't actually waiting on the other side of your boundaries? What if some people will stay, even when you say no, will respect you more for your honesty, will love you better when they know the real you instead of the compliant version? And what if the people who leave when you start having limits were never meant to stay, were never capable of real reciprocity, were only there because your self-abandonment made the relationship easy for them? There's a kind of work you do that no one sees, no one counts, no one thanks you for. It's the emotional labor of managing other people's feelings, anticipating their needs before they voice them, smoothing over tension before it becomes conflict, making yourself small so others can feel big. You carry this weight so constantly that you've stopped noticing how heavy it is. Your calendar fills with obligations you didn't choose. Your energy drains into people who take without asking if you have anything left to give. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that you're allowed to rest, that you're allowed to be unavailable, that you're allowed to exist without being useful to someone else. This invisible labor shows up in 1,000 small ways throughout your day. It's in the way you phrase your emails, carefully worded to avoid any possibility of offense. It's in the way you manage group dynamics, noticing who feels left out and making sure to include them. It's in the way you remember everyone's preferences, their dietary restrictions, their triggers, their sensitivities, and shape your behavior accordingly. It's in the way you apologize preemptively, softening your requests with multiple "I'm sorry" statements, even when you have nothing to be sorry for. It's in the mental load of tracking everyone's emotional state and adjusting yourself accordingly, making sure no one is uncomfortable, no one is upset, no one is disappointed. Sociologist Ali Hochschild coined the term emotional labor in 1983 to describe the work of managing feelings, both your own and others, to create a desired emotional state. She was studying flight attendants who had to maintain a pleasant demeanor regardless of how they actually felt. But the concept applies far beyond professional settings. For people pleasers, emotional labor is the unpaid, unacknowledged work of maintaining relational harmony by constantly monitoring and managing the emotional atmosphere, often at great cost to their own well-being. This labor is exhausting precisely because it never ends. There's no moment when you can fully rest, no relationship where you can completely let your guard down, no interaction where you don't have to carefully calibrate your response. You're always working, always performing, always managing, even when it looks like you're just having a casual conversation or sitting quietly in a room with others. Your nervous system is constantly scanning for signs of displeasure, discomfort, or disappointment, ready to adjust yourself the moment you detect any. It's hypervigilance disguised as thoughtfulness, anxiety disguised as care. And the weight of this labor compounds over time. Each small act of accommodation, each moment of self-monitoring, each adjustment you make to keep the peace, they all add up. What starts as a slight tension in your shoulders becomes chronic pain. What begins as occasional fatigue becomes persistent exhaustion. What feels like minor stress becomes burnout so complete you can barely recognize yourself anymore. But because this labor is invisible, because it's seen as just being considerate or just being nice. No one notices how much it costs you, sometimes not even you. The pattern becomes a trap. You can't stop managing other people's feelings because you've trained them to expect it. You've trained yourself to believe your worth depends on it. You've built entire relationships on the foundation of your emotional labor, and now you're afraid that if you stop, if you let people feel their own discomfort, if you stop smoothing everything over, the relationships will crumble, and maybe some of them will. Maybe some relationships only worked because you were doing all the emotional heavy lifting while the other person coasted on your effort. But continuing to carry that weight doesn't change the imbalance. It only ensures that you'll eventually collapse under it. Deep in the psychology of people-pleasing lives, a hunger that never quite gets satisfied. It's the craving for approval, for validation, for the confirmation that you matter, that you're good enough, that you're worthy of love, and so you perform. You shape yourself into whatever version you think will earn affection. You become agreeable in one relationship, competent in another, entertaining in a third. You study people like a language, learning their preferences, their triggers, their expectations, and then you mold yourself to fit. But here's what happens when you build your sense of self on other people's opinions. You become a reflection instead of a person. A mirror that shows everyone what they want to see but never reveals what's actually inside you. This hunger for approval is insatiable because external validation can never fill an internal void. You can collect 1,000 compliments, 100 affirmations, dozens of people telling you you're wonderful and still feel empty inside. Because what you're really seeking isn't praise, it's proof that you're acceptable, that you're lovable, that you won't be abandoned. And no amount of external approval can provide that proof, permanently. Each instance of validation feels good for a moment, but then it fades, and you're left searching for the next hit, the next confirmation, the next piece of evidence that you're okay. Psychologists call this external locus of control, the tendency to locate your sense of worth outside yourself rather than anchoring it internally. When your self-esteem depends on other people's reactions, you're perpetually unstable, constantly at the mercy of forces you can't control. Someone's bad mood becomes evidence that you've failed. A moment of criticism feels like confirmation of your inadequacy. A person's withdrawal feels like proof that you're unlovable. You become a leaf in the wind, blown in whatever direction the people around you are moving, with no solid ground beneath you, no internal foundation to stand on when external validation isn't available. And so you work harder. You try to be more helpful, more accommodating, more perfect. You scan constantly for signs of approval or disapproval, adjusting your behavior in real time based on the feedback you're receiving. You become a master at reading micro-expressions, detecting the slightest shift in tone, noticing the tiny changes in body language that might signal someone's displeasure. This vigilance exhausts you, but you can't stop because stopping feels like giving up on your only strategy for earning love. You've convinced yourself that if you can just be good enough, helpful enough, perfect enough, then finally you'll get the approval that will make you feel secure. But it never comes. Or if it does come, it never stays. The tragedy is that in seeking approval, you abandon the one person whose approval actually matters, yourself. You spend so much energy trying to become what others want that you lose touch with what you want. You work so hard to earn external validation that you forget to offer yourself internal compassion. You chase the approval of people who might not even know you, while ignoring the quiet voice inside that's been trying to tell you that you're already worthy, already enough, already deserving of love just because you exist. Not because of what you do, not because of how you serve others, not because of your usefulness or accommodating nature, but simply because you're human. But here's what you've learned to believe instead: that your worth must be proven, that love must be earned, that acceptance is contingent on performance. And so the hunger continues, driving you to shapeshift and accommodate and please, searching for something outside yourself that can only ever be found within. Searching for permission to exist as you are from people who can't give it, because they are often searching for the same thing themselves. And in that endless search, you remain perpetually hungry, perpetually performing, perpetually hoping that the next act of accommodation will finally be the one that makes you feel secure. There was a time, probably so long ago you can't remember it clearly, when no was just a word, simple, honest, complete. But somewhere between childhood and now, no became dangerous. It became the thing that might make people angry, disappointed, distant. So you learned to soften it, to qualify it, to apologize for it before you even said it. "I'm sorry, but I can't" became your compromise, as if needing to decline required an apology, as if having limits was something to feel guilty about. And over time, even that qualified no became too risky, so you stopped saying it altogether. You said yes and resented it, yes and regretted it, yes and felt something inside you grow quieter, smaller, more resigned. The lost art of the no isn't really about the word itself. It's about what the word represents, the ability to define where you end and others begin, to assert that your time and energy have value, to communicate that your needs matter as much as anyone else's. When you lose the capacity to say no, you lose the ability to have boundaries, and without boundaries you become permeable, absorbing everyone else's needs and expectations and demands until there's nothing left of you but a shape designed to accommodate others. You might remember the first time you wanted to say no but couldn't. Maybe it was something small, a request that felt reasonable enough that refusing it would have seemed petty or unkind. So you said yes even though something inside you resisted. And that yes felt uncomfortable, not because the task itself was terrible, but because you'd overridden your own truth to maintain harmony. But the discomfort passed, and the relationship continued, and no one knew that you'd silenced yourself. So you learned that you could survive the dissonance between what you felt and what you said, that you could tolerate the gap between your authentic response and your accommodating one. And once you learned you could tolerate it, you started doing it more often. The gap between your truth and your words grew wider. The yes became more automatic, required less thought, felt less jarring each time. You developed what psychologists call response habituation, your nervous system's adaptation to repeated exposure to something uncomfortable. The discomfort of saying yes when you meant no didn't disappear, but you stopped noticing it as acutely. It became background noise, a constant low-level distress that you learned to function through, like living next to a highway and eventually tuning out the sound of traffic. But here's what happens when you lose access to no. Yes stops meaning anything. When every request receives the same answer regardless of your actual capacity or desire, when you agree to everything because declining isn't an option, your yes becomes meaningless. It doesn't communicate genuine willingness or authentic consent. It just means you're available, you're compliant, you're unable to protect your own boundaries. And relationships built on that kind of yes aren't really relationships. They're arrangements where one person has needs and another person has no choice but to meet them. The no you can't say doesn't just disappear, it goes somewhere. Sometimes it turns into passive aggression, the subtle ways you express resentment without directly refusing. Sometimes it becomes procrastination, agreeing to things you then avoid doing. Sometimes it manifests as physical symptoms, your body saying no when your voice won't, headaches and stomach problems and exhaustion that gives you a socially acceptable reason to be unavailable. Your no finds a way out, just not an honest one, not a direct one, not one that actually communicates your truth clearly. Learning to say no again, after years of automatic yes responses, feels dangerous. It feels selfish. It feels like a betrayal of who you've been, of how you've maintained relationships, of the role you've played in other people's lives. Because saying no means disappointing someone. It means they might be frustrated or hurt or angry. It means you can't be everything to everyone anymore. It means accepting that you have limits, that your capacity is finite, that you're human rather than superhuman. And after years of trying to be limitless, accepting your limits feels like failure. But a no, a clear, honest no without apology or extensive justification, is an act of self-respect. It's you saying, my time matters, my energy matters, my peace matters. It's you drawing a line between what you will and won't accept, what you can and can't do, what serves you and what depletes you. It's not cruelty, it's clarity. And the relationships that can't survive your clarity were never serving you in the first place. They were just using your inability to say no. You've built a life that looks, from the outside, remarkably put together. You show up on time, you remember birthdays, you offer help before anyone asks. You're the reliable one, the one people know they can count on, the one who never says no, never complains, never lets anyone see the exhaustion accumulating behind your eyes. And there's a certain safety in that role, isn't there? When you're perfect, when you're helpful, when you're indispensable, people need you, and being needed feels close enough to being loved that you've accepted it as a substitute. But perfection is a performance that requires you to hide everything messy, everything uncertain, everything human about yourself. And the cost of that performance is connection, real connection, the kind that only happens when people see you as you actually are. The theatre of perfection demands constant vigilance. You can't let the mask slip, can't let anyone see the effort it takes to maintain the facade, can't reveal that sometimes you're tired or frustrated or resentful or unsure. You've created a character, the capable one, the helpful one, the one who has it all together, and now you're trapped inside that character. You have to keep performing it, even when you desperately want to rest, even when the costume feels too tight, even when you can barely remember who you were before you started playing this role. This kind of perfection is isolating, because when you hide all your struggles, when you present only your competence and never your vulnerability, you deny others the opportunity to truly know you. They see the polished version, the managed version, the version that needs nothing and offers everything. They don't see you at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep because you're worried about all the things you committed to. They don't see the tears you cry alone because you're overwhelmed but can't admit it. They don't see how close you are to breaking, how much this performance costs you, how desperately you wish someone would see through the act and tell you it's okay to stop. But they can't see what you won't show, and you won't show it because vulnerability feels like weakness, like failure, like evidence that you're not actually the capable person you've been pretending to be. You've internalized a belief that your worth lies in your usefulness, in your reliability, in your ability to handle everything without complaint. So you keep performing, keep pretending, keep hiding anything that might reveal that you're human, that you struggle, that you need support just like everyone else. Psychologist Brené Brown has spent decades researching vulnerability and shame, and one of her central findings is that true connection requires vulnerability, the willingness to be seen as imperfect, uncertain, struggling. But for people pleasers, vulnerability feels too dangerous. It feels like giving people ammunition to reject you, evidence that you're not actually as competent as you've claimed, proof that you're not worthy of the acceptance you've been working so hard to earn. So you maintain the performance, trading authentic connection for the illusion of acceptability. And the performance is exhausting. It requires you to anticipate problems before they arise, to have solutions ready before anyone asks, to be 10 steps ahead of everyone else so you can smooth their path. It requires suppressing your own needs because acknowledging them would reveal that you're not actually self-sufficient, that you need support too, that you're not the endless well of capability you've presented yourself as. It requires perfection, not just in what you do, but in how you appear while doing it, competent and calm and unruffled no matter how chaotic things actually feel inside. But perfection is a lie. It's a standard no human can actually meet, which means you're destined to fail at it eventually. And when you do fail, when the mask slips and someone sees your exhaustion, or your frustration, or your limits, it feels catastrophic. It feels like you've been exposed as a fraud, like everything you've built will crumble now that someone has seen you're not actually perfect. But here's what's true. That moment of imperfection, that crack in the facade, that's often when real connection becomes possible. Because people don't connect with perfection, they connect with humanity. And humanity includes struggle, includes limitation, includes the messy, complicated reality of being a person trying to navigate a difficult world. The question is whether you're willing to let people see that, whether you're willing to risk rejection for the possibility of real acceptance, whether you can bear to stop performing long enough to discover whether anyone will stay when you're not being useful, when you're not being perfect, when you're just being yourself. There's a feeling that accumulates over time when you give more than you want to give, when you say yes more than you mean to say yes. It starts small, barely noticeable. A tiny flicker of irritation when someone asks for your help again. A quiet sigh you suppress when you realize your own plans don't matter as much as someone else's needs. But gradually that feeling grows. It sits in your chest like a stone, heavy and hard, and its name is resentment. You resent the people you help because they keep asking. You resent yourself for not knowing how to stop. And the cruelest part is that no one else knows this resentment exists because you've become so skilled at hiding it, at smiling while you're drowning, at saying of course when you mean I can't anymore. Resentment is the price of unexpressed boundaries. It's what builds up in the space where your authentic no should have been, where your limits should have been communicated, where your needs should have been voiced. Every time you say yes when you mean no, a small deposit of resentment goes into an account you didn't know you were opening. And over time, with compound interest, that account grows until the balance becomes impossible to ignore. You find yourself snapping at people for minor things, feeling irritable for no clear reason, withdrawing from relationships that used to bring you joy. The resentment is leaking out, expressing itself indirectly because it can't be expressed directly. This resentment is confusing because it coexists with genuine care. You do want to help the people you love. You do value being reliable and supportive, but somewhere along the way, helping stopped being a choice and became an obligation. It stopped being something you offered freely and became something expected of you, demanded of you, taken for granted. And now you're stuck in a pattern where saying no feels impossible but saying yes feels unbearable, where you resent people for asking but also resent yourself for agreeing, where every interaction leaves you feeling used but also ashamed for feeling that way. The psychology of resentment is complex. Research shows that resentment often stems from perceived injustice, the feeling that there's an imbalance in a relationship where one person gives more than they receive. For people pleasers, that imbalance is chronic. You're constantly overgiving, overextending, overcommitting, while others have learned to take what you offer without questioning whether it's sustainable. They're not necessarily bad people, they're just operating within the dynamic you've created, one where your needs are invisible and your availability is unlimited. But here's the painful truth. They don't know you're reaching your limit because you won't tell them. You keep smiling, keep agreeing, keep showing up, giving them no indication that anything has changed, that you're struggling, that the balance needs to shift. And then you resent them for not noticing, for not intuiting what you refuse to communicate, for taking what you keep offering. It's an impossible situation. You're angry at people for patterns you've reinforced, for dynamics you've maintained, for taking you at your word when your word is always yes. The resentment also turns inward. You're frustrated with yourself for not having stronger boundaries, for not being able to say no, for caring so much about other people's reactions that you sacrifice your own well-being. You judge yourself harshly, calling yourself weak or pathetic or too sensitive, as if the problem is your limitation rather than the unreasonable demands being placed on your limited resources. You internalize the belief that if you were stronger, better, more capable, you could keep doing what you've been doing without feeling resentful. But that's not true. Anyone would feel resentful in a situation where they're chronically overgiving and under-receiving. The problem isn't your sensitivity, it's the unsustainability of the pattern itself, and the resentment corrodes relationships from the inside. It creates distance where there used to be closeness. It turns interactions that should be enjoyable into obligations you dread. It makes you withdraw emotionally even as you continue to show up physically, going through the motions of care while feeling increasingly disconnected from the person you're helping. They might sense something has changed, might notice that you seem distant or short-tempered, but they don't know why, because you won't explain that you've been drowning in your inability to say no, that you need the balance to shift, that this pattern isn't working anymore. The only way out of resentment is through honesty, through finally voicing the no you should have voiced months or years ago, through having the difficult conversations where you admit that you've been overextending yourself, that you need to pull back, that the current dynamic isn't sustainable. These conversations are terrifying because they risk disappointment, conflict, rejection. But continuing to accommodate while silently resenting accomplishes nothing except the slow death of relationships that might have been saved if you'd been willing to be honest about your limits before the resentment grew too large to ignore. Behind the facade of capability, behind the mask of endless availability, you're tired. Not just physically tired, though your body certainly feels it, the tension in your shoulders, the headaches that appear from nowhere, the sleep that never quite restores you. But there's a deeper exhaustion, an emotional depletion that comes from constantly managing other people's needs while neglecting your own. Psychologists call this compassion fatigue, the wearing down of empathy that happens when you give without replenishing, when you care for others without caring for yourself. And what makes it worse is that no one sees it, because you've trained yourself to hide your tiredness, to push through, to keep functioning no matter how empty you feel inside. This exhaustion is cumulative. Each day you wake up with a little less energy than you had the day before. Each week you feel a little more depleted, a little more disconnected from yourself, a little more like you're performing life rather than living it. But you can't stop because stopping would mean letting people down, disappointing them, revealing that you're not actually as strong as they think you are. So you keep going, running on fumes, telling yourself you'll rest later, that you just need to get through this week or this month or this project, that soon things will slow down and you'll be able to recover. But things don't slow down, because the pattern doesn't change unless you change it. People keep asking because you keep saying yes. Obligations keep accumulating because you keep accepting them. Your calendar stays full because you haven't learned to leave space in it for rest, for yourself, for nothing. And so the exhaustion deepens, becomes chronic, transforms from something you feel occasionally into something you're constantly, a permanent state of depletion that you've learned to function through but can't quite remember how to escape. The exhaustion shows up in your body in ways you might not connect to their source. The immune system that can't seem to fight off minor illnesses. The digestive system that's chronically upset. The sleep that's restless even when you're exhausted. The injuries that won't quite heal. Your body is trying to force you to rest, to slow down, to stop overextending, but you interpret these signals as inconveniences to push through rather than messages to heed. You take medication for the symptoms but don't address the root cause, which is that you're asking your body to sustain a pace and a pattern of self-neglect that it wasn't designed to handle indefinitely. Research on burnout shows that chronic stress, the kind that comes from constantly overgiving without adequate rest or replenishment, causes measurable changes in the brain and body. Stress hormones like cortisol remain elevated, wearing down systems that are supposed to be activated only temporarily during actual emergencies. The nervous system gets stuck in sympathetic activation, always on, always vigilant, unable to fully rest even during moments that should be restful. And, over time, this chronic activation leads to a kind of collapse, where even simple tasks feel overwhelming, where you can barely muster the energy to do the basics, where everything feels hard in a way it didn't used to. But the exhaustion isn't just physical. There's an emotional and spiritual exhaustion that comes from living a life where you're perpetually available to others, but never available to yourself. Where you've become so skilled at caring for everyone else that you've forgotten how to care for yourself, or you've convinced yourself that your own care doesn't matter as much, that it's selfish or indulgent to prioritize your own rest when so many people need you. So you keep giving from an empty cup, wondering why you feel so depleted, not understanding that you can't pour from a vessel that's dry, that eventually the source runs out if it's never replenished. And the tragic thing is that your exhaustion often gets misinterpreted. People might see you as less competent, less reliable, less like yourself. They notice that you're more irritable, less patient, less present. But they don't see the years of overgiving that led to this state. They don't see the 1,000 times you said yes when you should have said no. They don't see the nights you lost sleep worrying about everyone else's problems while neglecting your own. They just see the current version of you, depleted and struggling, and they might judge you for not being the person you used to be, not understanding that you depleted yourself trying to be everything to everyone. The only way out of this exhaustion is to stop, to rest, to say no to new obligations and yes to your own recovery, to protect your energy as fiercely as you've been giving it away, to understand that you cannot care for others from a place of complete depletion, that sustainable care requires that you care for yourself first, that you're not actually helping anyone by running yourself into the ground. But stopping feels impossible when your worth feels tied to your usefulness, when you've been performing at this level for so long that anything less feels like failure, and so the exhaustion continues deepening until eventually something breaks and you're forced to rest, to stop, to finally acknowledge what your body has been trying to tell you all along. There's a hidden belief operating beneath your people-pleasing, one you might not have articulated even to yourself. It goes something like this: if I'm good enough, helpful enough, agreeable enough, I can control how people feel about me. If I meet their needs perfectly, they won't leave, won't criticize, won't withdraw their affection. It's a kind of magical thinking, this idea that your behavior can guarantee someone else's response. But the truth, the hard truth that takes years to accept, is that you can't control how people feel. You can exhaust yourself trying. You can sacrifice every boundary, every need, every authentic part of yourself, and still, someone might be disappointed, still someone might leave, still someone might not love you the way you hope. This illusion of control is seductive because it offers a solution to the fundamental uncertainty of relationships. If you can just figure out the right formula, if you can just be helpful enough or agreeable enough or perfect enough, then you can make people stay, make them love you, make them think well of you. It turns relationships into equations you can solve rather than complex human connections full of variables you can't predict or manage. And there's something comforting in that, in believing that you have power over outcomes, that you're not at the mercy of other people's feelings and choices. But this belief traps you in an exhausting cycle. Because if you believe your behaviour controls other people's responses, then every negative response feels like your failure. Someone is disappointed, you weren't helpful enough. Someone withdraws, you weren't attentive enough. Someone leaves, you weren't good enough. The responsibility for every relationship outcome falls on your shoulders, and you carry that weight believing that if you just tried harder, accommodated more, given more of yourself, the outcome would have been different. But that's not how relationships work. People have their own histories, their own wounds, their own reasons for how they show up or don't show up that have nothing to do with you. Psychologists call this an internal locus of control gone awry. Having an internal locus of control, believing your actions influence outcomes, is generally healthy. It motivates effort and discourages helplessness. But when you extend that to believing you can control other people's feelings and choices through your behaviour, you've crossed into magical thinking. You've taken responsibility for things that aren't actually under your control, and in doing so, you've made yourself perpetually accountable for other people's emotional states. It's exhausting, and ultimately impossible. You cannot be good enough to prevent someone from leaving if they want to leave. You cannot be helpful enough to make someone appreciate you if they're not inclined to appreciate. You cannot control the uncontrollable through sheer force of accommodation. And here's what makes this pattern so persistent. Sometimes it works. Sometimes your helpfulness does result in someone staying. Sometimes your accommodation does prevent conflict. Sometimes your people-pleasing does earn you approval. But correlation isn't causation. They might have stayed anyway. The conflict might have been minor even without your intervention. The approval might have come regardless. But you credit your behaviour for these outcomes, reinforcing the belief that your control is real, that your strategy works. You don't see all the times it didn't work, all the ways you exhausted yourself for outcomes that would have happened anyway, all the relationships that ended despite your best, efforts to people-please your way into security. The need for control often stems from early experiences of unpredictability or chaos. If you grew up in an environment where love felt inconsistent or conditional, where you couldn't predict how adults would respond, developing strategies to try to control outcomes makes sense. It's an attempt to create safety in an environment that felt unsafe, to develop formulas for earning love in a context where love felt uncertain. The problem is that those childhood strategies don't translate well to adult relationships. Adult relationships require vulnerability, authenticity, the ability to be yourself, and trust that people will stay or leave based on genuine compatibility rather than your performance. But letting go of control means accepting uncertainty. It means acknowledging that you can't guarantee how people will respond, that doing everything right doesn't ensure positive outcomes, that sometimes people leave even when you've been perfect, that sometimes people stay even when you've been messy and human. It means trusting that real relationships, sustainable relationships, don't require you to control outcomes through constant accommodation. They require honesty, boundaries, authenticity. They require that you show up as yourself and allow others to decide whether that's what they want. And that's terrifying when you've spent your life believing your worth depends on getting people to want you through careful management of their experience of you. When you've spent years becoming whatever other people need, something strange happens to your sense of self. You start to lose track of who you are when no one's watching, what you want when it doesn't matter what anyone else wants, who you'd be if you weren't busy being everything to everyone. Your preferences become unclear. Your desires feel distant, almost theoretical. Someone asks you a simple question, "What do you want for dinner?" Or, "What would make you happy?" And you genuinely don't know, because you've trained yourself to scan for other people's preferences first, to find your answer in their expectations, to locate yourself through their needs, and slowly, quietly, your authentic self, the one with opinions and boundaries and desires, fades into the background like a ghost. This identity confusion is one of the most disorienting aspects of chronic people-pleasing. You've become so skilled at shape-shifting, at reading what each person needs and becoming that you've lost the thread of who you actually are underneath all the adaptations. You have a different personality with your parents than with your friends, a different version of yourself at work than at home, a different energy with each person depending on what you've learned they respond well to. And none of these versions feel entirely authentic, but none of them feel entirely false either, because you've been performing them for so long, they've become part of you, layers of adaptation covering the original self like coats of paint obscuring the original colour of a wall. When asked about your preferences, you default to "I don't mind" or "whatever you want," because genuinely, you've lost touch with what you want. Your desire mechanism has atrophied from disuse. You've spent so long prioritising other people's preferences that you can't access your own, or when you do access them, they feel trivial, unimportant, not worth voicing compared to someone else's more clearly articulated wants. So you defer, accommodate, go along with whatever others decide, and in doing so, you disappear a little more from your own life. Psychologists who study identity formation talk about the importance of individuation, the process of developing a clear sense of self separate from others. This typically happens during adolescence, but for people pleasers, it often gets interrupted or delayed. Instead of developing a strong internal sense of who you are, you developed a highly responsive external orientation, constantly checking what others need from you and adjusting accordingly. Your identity became relational rather than intrinsic, defined by your role in others' lives rather than by your own values, interests, and preferences. This creates a specific kind of emptiness, not the depression that comes from loss or trauma, but a hollowness that comes from self-abandonment, from having spent so long accommodating others that there's no solid you left at the centre. You look for yourself and find only mirrors, reflections of other people's needs and expectations with no core, no substance, no authentic self underneath the adaptations. And this realization, when it comes, can be devastating, because it means that years of effort, years of trying to earn love through accommodation, have left you without the one thing you actually need, a self that feels real, solid, yours. Recovering your sense of identity requires a kind of archaeological work. You have to dig through layers of accommodation and adaptation to find what's underneath. You have to ask yourself questions you haven't asked in years. What do I actually enjoy when no one's watching? What makes me feel alive? What are my values? Not the ones I've adopted from others, but the ones that feel true in my core? What would I do with my life if I wasn't organising it around other people's expectations? And at first, these questions might be met with silence. The answers have been buried so deep, neglected so thoroughly, that assessing them takes time and patience. But slowly, with practice and attention, your authentic self begins to emerge. You notice small preferences. I actually hate that restaurant everyone else loves. I actually would rather stay home tonight than go out. I actually disagree with what that person said. These small recognitions are the beginning of reclaiming yourself. They're acts of resurrection, bringing back to life the parts of you that learned to go dormant, because being yourself felt too risky, too likely to result in rejection. And with each small claim of preference, with each boundary set, with each honest no, you become a little more solid, a little more real, a little more yourself. For many people pleasers, the pattern doesn't begin with a choice, it begins with survival. Perhaps you grew up in a home where love was unpredictable, where a parent's mood could shift without warning, where your job as a child was to keep the peace, to read the room, to become whatever was needed to prevent anger or withdrawal or chaos. Trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk writes about how childhood adversity teaches us to abandon our own needs in service of safety, how we learn to become hyper-vigilant to other people's emotional states because our survival depended on it. And what worked then, what kept you safe in an unsafe environment, becomes the pattern you carry into every relationship, long after the original danger has passed. This is the relationship between trauma and people-pleasing that's often misunderstood. People-pleasing isn't weakness or pathology. It's adaptation. It's intelligence. It's a highly functional strategy for navigating relationships where your safety depends on managing other people's emotional states. If you grew up with a parent who was emotionally volatile, you learned to read their moods with exquisite precision so you could adjust your behaviour before their mood became dangerous. If you grew up with a parent who was emotionally unavailable, you learned to minimise your needs so you wouldn't burden them and risk losing what little connection was available. If you grew up in a chaotic environment, you learned to be the calm, helpful, no-trouble child who made things easier rather than harder. These adaptations made sense in context. They helped you survive your childhood. The problem is that your nervous system doesn't know that childhood is over. It still operates from the same threat assessment, still believes that your safety depends on managing others' emotional states, still sounds the alarm whenever you consider setting a boundary or expressing a need. The trauma response, the hypervigilance to others' emotions and the suppression of your own needs, continues long after it's necessary because your nervous system is trying to keep you safe using the only strategy it knows. Van der Kolk's research shows that traumatic experiences, especially chronic childhood trauma, change how the nervous system functions. The part of your brain responsible for detecting threats becomes oversensitive, perceiving danger in situations that aren't actually dangerous. Meanwhile, the part responsible for calming the nervous system becomes underactive, making it hard to soothe yourself when you're activated. This means that situations that might trigger mild anxiety in someone else, like saying no or disappointing someone, trigger a full survival response in you because your nervous system has learned that these situations are dangerous even when objectively they're not. Complex trauma, the kind that comes from chronic relational stress rather than a single incident, is particularly relevant to understanding people-pleasing. Researchers like Pete Walker describe complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, which includes symptoms like emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, and a pattern of fawning, trying to please and appease as a survival strategy. For people with this kind of trauma history, people-pleasing isn't just a preference or personality trait. It's a deeply ingrained survival mechanism, activated automatically whenever the nervous system perceives relational threat. The fawn response, as Walker calls it, is one of 4 survival responses alongside fight, flight, and freeze. When fighting back isn't safe and fleeing isn't possible and freezing won't help, you fawn. You try to make yourself useful, agreeable, non-threatening. You try to befriend the source of danger or at least avoid triggering their anger. You become what they need so they won't hurt you. For children in unsafe homes, this is brilliant strategy. For adults in safe relationships, it's a cage. Understanding the trauma roots of people-pleasing can be both relieving and painful. Relieving because it explains why changing the pattern is so hard, why your people-pleasing feels so automatic and unchosen. It's not a character flaw, it's a trauma response. But painful because it means acknowledging what you endured, the ways your early environment failed to provide the safety you needed, the adaptations you had to make as a child that are now constraining you as an adult. Healing requires grieving the childhood you should have had where your needs mattered, where expressing emotions was safe, where you could be yourself without fear. And healing also requires slowly, gently teaching your nervous system that the old danger has passed, that you're not in that childhood home anymore, that the people in your life now, or the people you choose to have in your life, won't hurt you for having boundaries. That safety is possible even when you're not constantly accommodating. This retraining happens slowly, through small acts of boundary setting that don't result in catastrophe, through therapy or somatic work that helps regulate your nervous system, through building relationships with people who can handle your authenticity without withdrawing or punishing. It's not about understanding your patterns intellectually, it's about helping your body learn at a visceral level that you're safe enough now to be yourself. Here's a paradox that sits at the heart of people-pleasing. You can be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly alone. Because when you're always accommodating, always agreeable, always the version of yourself that makes others comfortable, no one actually knows you. They know the performance. They know the mask. They know the person who says yes and smiles and never causes trouble, but the real you, the one with needs and limits and complicated feelings, remains hidden, unknown, unseen. And there's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being in relationships where you're perpetually invisible, where connection happens only on the surface because you've never let anyone see what lies beneath. This loneliness is different from being physically alone. You can be surrounded by friends, loved by family, in a romantic relationship, and still feel this profound sense of isolation because the connection isn't real. It's not based on authentic knowing. People love the version of you that accommodates them, that makes their life easier, that never asks for much in return. But do they love you? The actual you? How could they when you've never shown them who that is, when you've been so busy being what they need that you've hidden everything else? The performance of people-pleasing creates intimacy's illusion without its substance. You share time and space with people, you do things for them, you're present in their lives, but you're not vulnerable, you're not revealing your struggles or doubts or fears, you're not asking for support, you're not showing them the messy, uncertain, fully human parts of yourself. So the relationship remains one-dimensional, functional, rather than intimate, based on what you can do for them, rather than who you actually are. And you might wonder why your relationships feel unsatisfying, even though you're doing everything right. You're helpful, available, supportive, but you feel empty after interactions that should be fulfilling. You feel lonely even when you're with people. That's because you're experiencing what psychologists call emotional loneliness, the loneliness that comes not from lack of connection, but from lack of authentic connection. Connection where you're truly seen and known and loved for who you actually are rather than what you do. Part of this loneliness comes from the burden of your secret. You know something about yourself, about your exhaustion and resentment and limits, that others don't know. You're constantly managing the gap between how you appear and how you feel, and that gap is isolating. You can't talk about it, because talking about it would reveal that you're not the endless source of capability you've presented yourself as. So you stay silent, smile through the exhaustion, keep the secret of your own struggle even as you listen to everyone else's struggles, and that silence, that secret keeping deepens the loneliness. There's also the loneliness of not being cared for the way you care for others. You show up for people in their hard moments. You remember the important things in their lives. You offer support without being asked. But when you're struggling, and you usually don't let people see when you're struggling, but when you do, the reciprocity often isn't there. Not because people are necessarily selfish, but because you've trained them not to see your needs, not to expect that you might need support, not to worry about whether you're okay because you're always okay, always capable, always fine. You've made yourself into a one-way street of care, and now you're lonely on that street because traffic only flows one direction. Recovering from this loneliness requires the terrifying act of revealing yourself, of letting people see you tired, overwhelmed, uncertain, of asking for support, of admitting when you're struggling, of showing the parts of yourself you've kept hidden because they felt too vulnerable, too messy, too risky. And it's terrifying because you don't know how people will respond. Will they reject you for being less capable than they thought? Will they withdraw because you're no longer easy? Will they stay but resent the shift in dynamic? Some won't handle it well. Some relationships were built entirely on your accommodation, and without that, there's no foundation left. Those relationships will end or transform significantly, and that loss will hurt. But other relationships, the ones with potential for real reciprocity, will deepen. People who care about you will be relieved to finally see the real you, will appreciate being let in, will rise to the occasion when you actually ask for support. You'll discover that being seen, really seen, is so much more fulfilling than being needed. That authentic connection, even when it includes your struggles and limits, is so much richer than the shallow connections that depend on you being perpetually accommodating. And slowly, the loneliness begins to ease, not because you have more people around you, but because the people who are around you actually know you. They've seen you at your worst and stayed. They've witnessed your struggles and offered support. They love you not for what you do, but for who you are. And that kind of connection, authentic connection, is the antidote to the loneliness that lives at the heart of people-pleasing. Somewhere along the way, you learned that anger wasn't safe, that expressing frustration meant you were difficult, ungrateful, too much. So you swallowed it. You pushed it down, smiled through it, told yourself it wasn't important enough to voice. But anger doesn't disappear when you deny it. It doesn't politely evaporate just because you've decided it's inconvenient. Instead, it goes underground. It becomes the passive-aggressive comment you didn't mean to make. It becomes the physical tension you carry in your jaw, your neck, your stomach. It becomes depression, that anger turned inward, that fury with nowhere to go except back at yourself. And the tragedy is that your anger often holds important information. It tells you when a boundary has been violated, when you're being treated unfairly, when something needs to change. Anger is a natural emotional response to perceived injustice or boundary violation. It's your psyche's way of saying, this isn't okay, this needs to stop, I need to protect myself. For people pleasers, the capacity to feel and express healthy anger has usually been suppressed, often through childhood experiences where anger was punished, shamed, or met with withdrawal. You learned that anger made you unlovable, that people responded to your anger by pulling away or punishing you, that expressing anger was dangerous to your relationships, so you learned to suppress it, to smile instead of frown, to accommodate instead of assert, to turn your anger inward rather than outward. But suppressed anger doesn't just vanish, it transforms. Sometimes it becomes passive aggression, the indirect expression of anger through subtle sabotage, forgetting to do things you agreed to, making comments with plausible deniability, expressing anger through inaction or delay rather than through direct communication. Sometimes it becomes somaticized, turning into physical symptoms like headaches, digestive issues, chronic pain, your body expressing the anger your voice won't speak. Sometimes it becomes depression, which Freud famously called anger turned inward, the redirection of anger from its legitimate external target back toward yourself, manifesting as self-criticism, self-punishment, a sense of worthlessness that's actually displaced rage. Gabor Mate, a physician who's written extensively about the relationship between emotional suppression and physical illness, argues that the inability to express anger, particularly in the context of chronic people-pleasing and putting others' needs first, contributes to a range of health problems. When anger is consistently suppressed, when you cannot or will not advocate for your own needs, your body remains in a state of chronic stress. The anger you won't express consciously still activates your nervous system, still floods your body with stress hormones, still creates the physiological conditions for disease. Your body keeps the score, as Van der Kolk wrote, and the score includes all the anger you've swallowed. Learning to access and express anger appropriately is often a crucial part of recovering from people-pleasing, but it's complicated because you might not even know you're angry. You've suppressed it so thoroughly, denied it so consistently, that you've lost touch with the feeling itself. What might be anger in someone else manifests as sadness in you, or anxiety, or just numbness. You have to learn to recognize anger's disguises, to notice when your exhaustion is actually anger, when your hurt is actually anger, when your resignation is actually anger that's given up hope of being heard. And then you have to learn that anger is not only acceptable but necessary, that it's information about what matters to you, what your limits are, what you will and won't tolerate. That expressing anger, when done appropriately, doesn't make you a bad person, or a difficult person, or too much. It makes you honest. It makes you human. It protects your boundaries. It communicates clearly that something needs to change. People pleasers often fear that expressing anger will damage relationships, but unexpressed anger does far more damage. It creates distance, breeds resentment, undermines intimacy. Clear, direct expression of anger, when it's truly about setting boundaries rather than attacking someone, often strengthens relationships because it provides clarity and prevents resentment from building. But learning to express anger after years of suppression is challenging. Your nervous system still perceives it as dangerous. Your first attempts might feel awkward or excessive, swinging from complete suppression to explosive expression before you find the middle ground of clear, boundaried anger. You might need support, therapy, safe relationships where you can practice voicing anger without catastrophic consequences, where you can learn that anger doesn't equal abandonment, that you can be angry and still be loved, that protecting yourself verbally is not only acceptable but necessary. Your anger is yours. It belongs to you. It's trying to protect you, trying to tell you important things about what you need and what's not working. The question is whether you're willing to listen to it, to honour it, to let it inform your boundaries instead of swallowing it and pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. Your body keeps the score, as Van der Kolk famously titled his work on trauma. And when you spend years prioritising everyone else's needs above your own, when you live in a constant state of self-abandonment, your nervous system pays the price. The stress hormones that flood your body when you say yes but mean no, when you accommodate beyond your capacity, when you suppress your authentic reactions, these don't just disappear. They accumulate. They manifest as tension, headaches, digestive issues, chronic fatigue, unexplained pain. Your body is trying to tell you something, trying to speak the truth your voice won't say. This is too much. You need rest. You deserve to take up space, to have needs, to exist without constantly proving your worth through usefulness. The connection between chronic people-pleasing and physical illness is increasingly recognized in psychosomatic medicine. When you're in a constant state of self-suppression, when you're perpetually accommodating beyond your actual capacity, your body exists in chronic stress. Your nervous system remains activated, your stress response engaged, your cortisol elevated. And this chronic activation, this sustained stress without adequate recovery, damages your body over time. It weakens your immune system, disrupts your digestion, interferes with sleep, contributes to inflammation, increases your risk for a range of chronic conditions. Gabor Mate's work explores how emotional repression, particularly the suppression of anger and authentic needs, contributes to conditions ranging from autoimmune disorders to cancer. While the mechanisms are complex and multiple factors contribute to illness, the pattern is clear. People who consistently prioritize others' needs while suppressing their own, who cannot say no, who carry the stress of perpetual accommodation, show higher rates of stress-related illness. Your body is not designed to maintain that level of suppression indefinitely. Something gives. The body's protest might start subtly. Tension in your shoulders that becomes chronic. Headaches that appear when you have to do something you don't want to do. Digestive issues that flare during particularly stressful periods of overcommitment. Sleep that becomes difficult. Your body too activated to rest even when exhausted. These early signals are your body trying to get your attention, trying to tell you that the pattern isn't sustainable, that you need to make changes. But people pleasers often override these signals, push through the discomfort, take medication to manage symptoms while ignoring the underlying cause. And if the early signals are ignored, the body's protests often escalate. Chronic conditions develop, pain that won't resolve, exhaustion that rest doesn't fix, illnesses that seem to appear without clear cause. Your body is trying to force you to stop, to rest, to change the pattern, because you won't choose to change it voluntarily. Illness becomes the only acceptable reason to be unavailable, the only justification strong enough to override your compulsion to accommodate. And tragically, even then, many people pleasers feel guilty for being sick, for burdening others with their needs, for not being able to fulfill their obligations even while their body's breaking down. The path to healing requires listening to your body, attending to the signals you've been ignoring, recognizing that your physical symptoms aren't separate from your emotional patterns, that your body's pain is connected to your inability to set boundaries, that your exhaustion is related to your chronic overgiving. It requires learning practices that help regulate your nervous system, whether that's through therapy, somatic experiencing, yoga, meditation, or simply regular rest and self-care that you protect as fiercely as you've been protecting others' needs. It requires understanding that caring for your body is not selfish, that rest is not laziness, that prioritizing your physical needs is not indulgent. Your body is the only one you have. It's the vehicle through which you experience life, connect with others, do the work you care about. And it cannot sustain chronic neglect indefinitely. At some point, it will force you to pay attention, one way or another. The question is whether you'll listen to the early signals or wait until the body's protest becomes so loud you have no choice but to hear it. Healing also means making different choices, setting boundaries even when it feels uncomfortable, saying no to obligations that will tax you beyond your capacity, prioritizing rest and self-care not as luxuries, but as necessities, learning to listen to your body's wisdom, to honor its signals, to treat it with the respect and care you've been giving to everyone else. Your body has been carrying the burden of your people-pleasing. It's time to lighten that load. There's often an unspoken hope living inside the people-pleaser's heart. It whispers, if I give enough, eventually someone will give back to me. If I'm there for everyone, someone will be there for me. If I prove my worth through service, I'll earn the kind of care I long for. But relationships don't work like transactions. Giving doesn't guarantee receiving. And what often happens is that you attract people who've learned to take what you offer without questioning whether you have anything left. People who mistake your chronic availability for desire, your inability to say no for genuine enthusiasm, and when you finally, desperately need support, you discover that the relationships you've built are one-directional, that people know you as the helper but have no practice being helped by you in return. This fantasy of reciprocity, the belief that your overgiving will eventually be rewarded with equal care, keeps many people-pleasers trapped in unsustainable patterns. You keep giving, keep helping, keep showing up, waiting for the moment when someone will notice how much you've given and decide to give back. You keep score mentally, not consciously perhaps, but somewhere inside you're tracking all the times you showed up for people, all the ways you helped, all the energy you invested, and you're waiting for reciprocation that often never comes, or comes in measures so small compared to what you gave that it feels like a mockery of balance. The painful truth is that relationships that begin with chronic one-sided giving rarely transform into reciprocal ones without significant confrontation and boundary setting. People acclimate to the dynamic you create. If you've always been the giver, they become the taker, not necessarily out of malice, but simply because that's the role you've offered and they've accepted. They don't know you need reciprocity because you've never indicated it. You've always been fine, always capable, always willing to help. Why would they think you need help in return? And even if they do recognize the imbalance intellectually, changing an established dynamic is difficult. It requires both people to be willing to do uncomfortable work, to renegotiate roles, to tolerate awkwardness as new patterns replace old ones. But many people resist change, especially when the current dynamic serves them. When you finally try to pull back from overgiving, when you start needing reciprocity instead of just offering unlimited support, some people will resist. They'll call you selfish. They'll express disappointment. They'll pressure you to return to the old pattern, because the old pattern worked for them, even if it was destroying you. The fantasy of reciprocity is particularly painful because it's not entirely unreasonable. In healthy relationships, there is reciprocity. Not perfect 50-50 at every moment, but over time, a general balance where both people give and receive, where support flows in both directions, where neither person is chronically depleted or chronically unsupported. But you don't have healthy relationships. You have relationships built on your overgiving, and trying to retrofit reciprocity into them requires dismantling the foundation they were built on. Some relationships can withstand that reconstruction, others can't. What's particularly insidious is that your overgiving often attracts people who are unable or unwilling to reciprocate. People with healthy boundaries, people who value reciprocity, often feel uncomfortable with someone who gives too much. They can sense the imbalance. They try to reciprocate or pull back to restore balance, or they avoid the relationship because it feels unhealthy. But people who are comfortable taking without giving, people who are self-focused or entitled or simply accustomed to having their needs prioritized, they're drawn to people pleasers. You make their life easy. You ask for nothing. You give everything. Why wouldn't they stay in that dynamic? So you find yourself surrounded by takers, wondering why no one seems to care about you the way you care about them, not recognizing that you've selected for people who can tolerate extreme imbalance, that you've screened out people who would have offered reciprocity because your overgiving made them uncomfortable. And now you're trapped in a network of relationships where you're perpetually giving and rarely receiving, exhausted and resentful, but also terrified of changing the pattern, because at least these one-sided relationships are relationships, and being alone feels more terrifying than being depleted. But those relationships aren't actually serving you. They're maintaining your exhaustion, reinforcing your belief that your only value is in giving, preventing you from experiencing what reciprocal connection actually feels like. The path forward requires releasing the fantasy that your overgiving will eventually earn you the care you deserve. It requires understanding that care must be requested, not earned. That reciprocity must be established as a foundation, not hoped for as a reward. That relationships worth having are relationships where your needs matter from the beginning, where you don't have to prove your worth through service before you're allowed to have needs too. It requires being willing to let go of relationships that can't transform into reciprocal ones. It requires seeking out people who value balance, who are uncomfortable with one-sided dynamics, who want to give as much as they receive. And it requires practicing asking for support, expressing your needs, expecting reciprocity instead of hoping for it. This is terrifying after years of one-sided giving, but it's the only path to relationships that sustain rather than deplete you, relationships where you're valued for who you are rather than what you do. When you look back at the years you've spent accommodating, pleasing, shaping yourself to fit other people's expectations, there's often a grief that rises. Grief for the dreams you postponed because someone else needed something. Grief for the relationships you stayed in too long because leaving felt too selfish. Grief for the voice you silenced, the boundaries you didn't set, the life you might have lived if you'd known you were allowed to choose yourself. This isn't about regret exactly, because you did what you knew how to do with the tools and understanding you had then. But still, there's a mourning process, an acknowledgement of what it cost you to be so endlessly available to everyone except yourself. This grief is real and deserves space. You lost time, years perhaps, spent living according to other people's preferences while your own remained unexamined. You lost opportunities, the job you didn't pursue because it would inconvenience someone, the move you didn't make because others needed you to stay, the hobbies and interests you never explored because you were too busy serving others. You lost relationships, walking away from people who might have actually known and loved the real you, because you were too busy maintaining relationships with people who only knew the accommodating version. You lost parts of yourself, the creativity that had no room to emerge when you were constantly managing others' needs, the confidence you never developed because you were always deferring to others' judgments, the authentic voice you learned to silence because speaking your truth caused friction, the dreams you had before you learned that your job was to help others achieve their dreams while putting your own on permanent hold. All of these losses are real, and pretending they're not, telling yourself it's fine, minimizing the cost of your people-pleasing, that's just another form of self-abandonment. Grief often comes in waves. You might be fine for days or weeks, and then something triggers the awareness of what you've lost, and suddenly you're crying over a life you never lived, a self you never became, choices you never made because you were too busy being what everyone else needed. Let yourself feel this grief. It's not self-pity or dwelling in the past. It's honoring what was lost, acknowledging the cost of the pattern you're working to change, making space for the sadness that comes with recognizing you deserved better, that you always deserved better, that you deserved relationships where you could be yourself and still be loved. Part of the grief might be anger too. Anger at the people who took advantage of your inability to say no. Anger at the systems and cultures that reward self-sacrifice while punishing boundary setting. Anger at yourself for participating in your own abandonment for so long. This anger is part of grief, part of the process of acknowledging loss and allowing yourself to feel the full range of emotions that come with it. Don't suppress this anger. Let it inform your boundaries moving forward. Let it fuel your commitment to living differently. But grief isn't only backward-looking. It also makes space for something new. When you grieve what was lost, you create room for what could be. When you acknowledge the cost of the old pattern, you become more committed to the new one. When you honor what you sacrificed, you become less willing to sacrifice anymore. Grief, as painful as it is part of the healing process. It marks the end of one way of being and the beginning of another. It's the necessary transition between who you were when you were people-pleasing and who you're becoming as you learn to honor yourself. And as you grieve, as you let yourself feel the full weight of what it cost you to accommodate everyone but yourself, you might also notice something else emerging: compassion. Compassion for the younger you who developed this pattern as the best available option in a difficult situation. Compassion for how hard you tried, how much you gave, how earnestly you believed that being good enough would earn you the love you deserved. Compassion for the fact that you were doing your best with the understanding you had, that you didn't know another way existed, that you were operating from wounds and fears that weren't your fault even if healing them is your responsibility now. Grief and compassion together create the conditions for real change. Grief acknowledges what was lost, compassion makes space for healing, and together they help you move forward not with bitterness, but with wisdom, not with regret, but with resolve to live differently from this point forward, to honor yourself in ways you never have before, to build a life where your needs matter as much as anyone else's. For most people pleasers, there comes a moment, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, when something shifts. Maybe it's a crisis, a betrayal, a breaking point where you finally give too much and collapse under the weight of it. Or maybe it's quieter than that, a slow accumulation of awareness that whispers, "This isn't sustainable. This isn't fair. This isn't the life you want to live." You start noticing the pattern. You start seeing how automatic your yeses become, how little consideration you give to your own needs before agreeing to someone else's. And in that noticing, in that awareness, something begins to crack open. Not painfully, necessarily, but truthfully. You start to see that the person you've been abandoning most consistently, most thoroughly, most completely is yourself. This awakening can come from many places. Sometimes it's a conversation with someone who reflects back the pattern you've been unable to see. Sometimes it's reading something that puts words to your experience, that makes you realize you're not alone in this, that what you've been doing has a name and it's not just your personality, it's a learned behavior. Sometimes it's your body finally refusing to cooperate anymore, forcing you to stop through illness or exhaustion or pain. Sometimes it's a moment of clarity where you suddenly see yourself from the outside and realize how much you've been sacrificing, how little you've been receiving, how unsustainable the whole pattern is. The awakening often comes with mixed feelings. Relief that you finally see the pattern clearly, that you understand what's been happening, that you have language for the exhaustion and resentment you've been carrying, but also fear about what comes next, about whether you can change, about what changing will cost you in terms of relationships and identity. There's sadness too, grief for the time lost, for how long you've been living this way, and maybe anger at yourself for not seeing it sooner, at others for taking advantage, at a world that rewards self-sacrifice while punishing boundary setting. But beneath all these feelings is something crucial: awareness. You can't change a pattern you can't see. The awakening, the moment you recognize your people-pleasing for what it is the necessary first step toward transformation. Before this moment, you were operating on autopilot, responding to requests automatically, saying yes without conscious thought. Now you can pause. You can notice the gap between what you actually want and what you're about to agree to. You can see yourself reaching for the old pattern and, at least sometimes, choose differently. This awareness doesn't immediately make change easy. Old patterns have momentum. Your nervous system still pulls you toward accommodation even when you consciously want to set a boundary. But awareness creates choice. It creates the possibility of responding differently, even if you don't always take that possibility, even if you still people please sometimes because the old pattern is so deeply ingrained. But awareness means you're no longer unconscious. You're awake to what you're doing and why, and that's the foundation for everything that follows. The awakening also often comes with a recognition that you're not alone, that this pattern is common, especially for women, especially for people from certain cultural backgrounds, especially for people with certain trauma histories. Understanding that your people-pleasing is part of a larger pattern, shaped by societal expectations and early experiences, can reduce the shame you might feel. This isn't a personal failing. This is an adaptation that made sense given your circumstances, and now you're ready to adapt differently, to develop new strategies that serve you better. And in that moment of awakening, in that recognition of the pattern and its costs, you also begin to see a different possibility. A life where your needs matter, where you can say no, where relationships are reciprocal, where you're loved for who you are rather than what you do. This vision might be hazy at first, might feel impossibly distant, but it's there, a new possibility emerging from the recognition of what isn't working anymore. And that vision, that possibility of living differently, becomes the North Star as you begin the difficult work of changing patterns that have defined your life for years or decades. Once you see the pattern clearly, once you understand how deeply people-pleasing has shaped your life, you face a new challenge: change. And change, even good change, even necessary change, is terrifying. Because if you start saying no, if you start setting boundaries, if you start prioritizing your own needs, what happens to your relationships? What happens to your identity as the helpful one, the reliable one, the one who never causes problems? There's a fear that if you become less accommodating, people will leave. And maybe some will. Maybe some relationships were only sustainable because you were willing to disappear inside them. But that loss, as painful as it might be, makes space for something more authentic, more reciprocal, more real. The terror of changing is rooted in the same fear that created the people-pleasing pattern in the first place, the fear of abandonment. You people-please because at some point you learned that being yourself, having needs, setting boundaries, these things resulted in, or risked resulting in, rejection. So you adapted, became accommodating, made yourself easy to love by making yourself useful. And now, changing the pattern means confronting the original fear. If you stop being useful, if you stop being easy, will people still want you? Will they stay? Or will you end up alone, which is what you've been trying to avoid all along? This fear is amplified by the fact that some people will leave. Not everyone can handle your transformation. Some people are in your life specifically because you don't have boundaries, because you're always available, because you never ask for much. When you start changing, when you start having limits and needs and expectations of reciprocity, these people will resist. They'll try to pull you back into the old dynamic. They'll call you selfish or difficult or different in a bad way. They might withdraw, punish you with silence or disappointment, or simply leave. And each loss confirms your fear. See, if you're not accommodating, people don't want you. But this is where the work of discernment becomes crucial. The people who leave when you start having boundaries, the people who can only handle you when you're self-abandoning, these aren't people who truly care about you. They care about what you do for them. They care about your usefulness. They care about the dynamic where they receive and you give. Losing these relationships, as painful as it is actually a gift. It reveals which connections were real and which were transactional. It clears space for relationships that can sustain your evolution, that can adapt to you having needs, that want you to be authentic rather than accommodating. The terror is also about identity. If you're not the helper, who are you? If you're not the one everyone can count on, what's your role? If you start saying no, if you start being less available, less perfect, less agreeable, will you still recognize yourself? People-pleasing becomes so central to identity that changing it feels like losing yourself, even though, paradoxically, people-pleasing already cost you yourself. But your brain doesn't know that. It just knows that the current pattern, as painful as it is familiar, and familiar feels safer than unknown even when familiar is actively harming you. The path through this terror requires courage, but also support. Therapy can help, providing a space to process the fear and grief that come with changing. Supportive relationships with people who want you to have boundaries, who encourage your growth even when it's uncomfortable. These relationships become anchors. Communities of other people doing this work, whether in support groups or online spaces or recovery programs, remind you that you're not alone, that others have walked this path, that the terror eventually subsides as you prove to yourself that you can survive having boundaries. And slowly, through repeated experiences of setting boundaries and surviving, your nervous system begins to learn something new. It learns that no doesn't always result in abandonment, that sometimes people respect boundaries, that some relationships actually improve when you're more honest, that the catastrophe you feared doesn't always materialize, and gradually the terror lessens. Not entirely, perhaps. Change always carries some fear, but it becomes manageable. It becomes something you can act despite rather than something that paralyzes you. And on the other side of that terror is a life where you finally get to be yourself. Learning to set boundaries after years of people-pleasing doesn't happen all at once. It starts small. Maybe it's declining an invitation you'd normally accept out of obligation. Maybe it's saying, "Let me think about it," instead of immediately agreeing. Maybe it's letting a phone call go to voicemail because you're tired and you need rest more than you need to be available. These small no's feel enormous when you first practice them. Your nervous system might panic, flooding you with anxiety, guilt, fear of rejection. But each time you choose yourself, each time you honor your own limits, you're rewiring decades of conditioning. You're teaching yourself that your needs matter, that boundaries aren't cruelty, that you can be both kind and unavailable, both caring and boundaried. The practice of small no's is exactly that practice. You're developing a skill that's atrophied from lack of use. Each no is a repetition, building the muscle of boundary setting, teaching your nervous system that saying no is survivable. At first, every boundary feels huge, feels risky, triggers all your fears about rejection and abandonment. But with practice, with repeated experiences of setting boundaries and surviving, the fear gradually lessens. Boundaries start to feel less catastrophic, more normal, more like something you're allowed to do. Start with low-stakes situations. Practice saying no to things that matter less, where the relationship can withstand your boundary, where the consequences of disappointing someone are minimal. The telemarketer who calls, the acquaintance who asks for a favor, the optional social event you really don't want to attend. Use these situations as training ground for the bigger no's you'll eventually need to voice. Notice what happens in your body when you say no. Notice the fear, the guilt, the urge to immediately backtrack and accommodate, but don't give in to it. Let the discomfort be there and say no anyway. You might need scripts at first, phrases that help you decline without extensive explanation or apology. "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. I need to decline, but thank you for understanding." Notice the impulse to over-explain, to justify your no, to apologize profusely. Practice resisting that impulse. A no is complete on its own. It doesn't require justification. You're allowed to decline without providing a dissertation on why you can't or don't want to do something. As you practice with smaller boundaries, you can gradually work up to bigger ones. Saying no to family members who are used to your automatic yes. Setting limits with friends who've been taking more than they give. Declining requests at work that would require you to sacrifice your well-being. Ending relationships that can't transform from one-sided to reciprocal. These bigger boundaries are harder because there's more at stake, more risk of real consequences, more potential for conflict or loss. But the practice with smaller boundaries has been preparing you, teaching you that you can survive disappointing people, that your worth doesn't depend on your availability. One particularly important boundary is the boundary around your time. People pleasers often have calendars filled with obligations they didn't truly choose, time committed to others with no space left for themselves. Practice protecting your time. Schedule time for rest, for hobbies, for nothing. And then defend that time as fiercely as you defend a commitment to someone else. When someone asks for your time during a period you've reserved for yourself, practice saying no. I'm not available then. You don't have to explain that you're not available because you've scheduled time to rest or read or do nothing. You're just not available. The boundary is enough. Another crucial practice is noticing when you're about to say yes from obligation rather than desire. Create a pause between someone's request and your response. Instead of immediately agreeing, say, "Let me check my schedule and get back to you," or "Let me think about it." Use a pause to check in with yourself. Do I actually want to do this? Do I have the capacity? Am I saying yes from genuine desire or from fear of saying no? Then respond honestly, even if honest means declining. The practice of small no's is cumulative. Each boundary you set makes the next one slightly easier. Each time you honour your limits and survive, you prove to yourself that boundaries are possible, that you can do this, that your relationships can withstand your honesty. And slowly, gradually, boundary setting stops feeling like an extreme act and starts feeling like normal self-care, like something you're allowed to do, like a necessary part of maintaining your well-being and your integrity. When you start setting boundaries, when you start saying no, some people won't understand. They'll call you selfish. They'll express disappointment. They'll wonder what happened to the person who used to be so helpful, so accommodating, so easy. And this is one of the hardest parts of recovery from people-pleasing. Learning to tolerate being misunderstood, to accept that not everyone will support your growth, to understand that some people benefited from your self-abandonment and they're not going to celebrate you stopping. Your job isn't to make them understand. Your job isn't to convince them that your needs are legitimate. Your job is simply to honour yourself anyway, even when it's uncomfortable, even when people project their discomfort back onto you. Being misunderstood feels terrible when you've spent your life trying to please everyone. You're accustomed to being seen as good, helpful, agreeable. Being perceived as selfish or difficult or changed in a bad way contradicts your entire identity. It triggers shame and self-doubt. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am being selfish. Maybe I should go back to accommodating. Maybe I'm doing this wrong. These thoughts are predictable responses to the discomfort of being misunderstood, but they're not accurate assessments. You're not selfish for having boundaries. You're not difficult for having needs. You're not wrong for finally honouring yourself. Understanding why people react negatively to your boundaries can help you take their reactions less personally. When you change a dynamic, especially a dynamic that was serving the other person, they experience loss. They lose access to your unlimited availability, your chronic willingness to prioritise their needs, your inability to refuse their requests. That loss is uncomfortable for them, and discomfort often manifests as anger or criticism directed at the person who caused it. So they blame you for becoming selfish, rather than recognising their own entitlement, their own comfort with a dynamic that was unsustainable for you. Some people's negative reactions come from projection. They see your boundary setting as judgment of their own lack of boundaries. If you can say no, it highlights that they can't. If you can prioritise yourself, it reveals that they've been abandoning themselves. Your change holds up a mirror to their own patterns, and instead of doing the work of looking at themselves, they criticise you for changing. This has nothing to do with you actually being wrong or selfish. It has everything to do with their discomfort with their own patterns. The work here is learning to sit with being misunderstood without immediately changing course to regain approval. This requires tolerating discomfort, both yours and others. It requires accepting that not everyone will understand or support your growth. It requires differentiating between feedback that's actually valid and feedback that's just resistance to change. Valid feedback might sound like, "I notice you're setting more boundaries and I support that. I'm working on adjusting to the new dynamic." Invalid feedback sounds like, "You've changed and I don't like it. You used to be so helpful. Now you're selfish." Part of tolerating being misunderstood is developing an internal sense of rightness that doesn't depend on external validation. You have to know from the inside that your boundaries are appropriate, that your needs are legitimate, that you're not actually selfish for taking care of yourself. This internal compass develops over time through practice and through connecting with people who support your boundaries. But it requires that you trust yourself even when others disagree, that you honour your own experience even when others invalidate it. It also helps to remember that people's opinions of you are not facts. They're interpretations filtered through their own experiences, needs, and biases. Someone calling you selfish doesn't make you selfish. It makes them uncomfortable with your boundaries. Someone expressing disappointment doesn't mean you've done something wrong. It means you're no longer accommodating them in the way they prefer. Their discomfort is information about them, not about you. Let them have their feelings without absorbing them as truth. And gradually, as you practice maintaining boundaries despite being misunderstood, something shifts. You become less dependent on others' approval. You develop confidence in your own choices. You learn that you can disappoint people and survive, that their criticism doesn't define you, that being misunderstood is uncomfortable but not catastrophic. And eventually you might even come to appreciate being misunderstood by people who can't handle your growth, because their misunderstanding clarifies who's actually capable of supporting the authentic you versus who was only comfortable with the accommodating version. But here's what happens when you start showing up authentically, when you start setting boundaries, when you start revealing the real you beneath the pleasing persona. You discover who actually wants to know you. Some relationships will fall away, yes, but the ones that remain, the ones that deepen, those become something different. They become reciprocal, they become honest. They become places where you can be tired, uncertain, human, where you can need support and receive it, where love doesn't depend on your usefulness. And you discover that real intimacy only happens when both people are allowed to be fully themselves, when both people can say no and yes honestly, when both people take turns holding and being held. The emergence of authentic connection often surprises people pleasers. You've been convinced for so long that people only want you for what you do, that being yourself would result in rejection, that vulnerability would drive people away. But the opposite is often true. When you finally risk showing yourself, the real you with needs and limits and complications, the relationships that matter don't end, they deepen. People are relieved to finally meet you, not the accommodating version, but the authentic person beneath the performance. Authentic connection requires vulnerability from both people. When you're people-pleasing, you're not vulnerable. You're defended, protected behind a mask of capability and agreeableness. But when you start setting boundaries, admitting when you're struggling, asking for support, you become vulnerable. And vulnerability creates the conditions for real intimacy. People can finally see you, know you, connect with the actual person, rather than the persona. And many people, especially people who are themselves authentic and boundaried, respond to that vulnerability with appreciation and increased closeness. You might be surprised by who steps up when you finally let them. The friend who seemed peripheral suddenly becomes central when you allow them to support you. The family member you thought wouldn't understand actually responds with compassion when you're honest about your struggles. The colleague who you kept at professional distance becomes a real friend when you stop performing perfection. These people were always capable of deeper connection. You just weren't allowing it because you were too busy accommodating, too defended behind your helpful persona, too unavailable for real reciprocity. And you learn what reciprocal relationships actually feel like. Relationships where both people give and receive, where support flows in both directions, where you're not the only one paying attention to needs and offering help, where your struggles matter as much as anyone else's, where love is based on mutual care rather than one person's usefulness. This kind of reciprocity feels foreign at first if you've never experienced it. It might even feel uncomfortable, receiving support, letting someone else help, allowing yourself to be held. But gradually you adapt to it, learn to receive as well as give, discover that balanced relationships are so much more fulfilling than the one-sided ones you're used to. Authentic connection also means being able to have conflict without catastrophe. When you're people-pleasing, you avoid conflict at all costs. But in authentic relationships, conflict happens and it's not the end. You can disagree, be upset with each other, work through misunderstandings, and the relationship survives. You learn that real relationships can handle tension, that people don't always leave just because you're unhappy, that expressing your authentic reactions, even negative ones, is part of intimacy. This is radically different from the fragile pseudo-connections you maintained through constant accommodation, where any conflict felt existential because the relationship was based on your agreeableness rather than genuine connection. And you discover that people who truly care about you want you to have boundaries. They don't want you to exhaust yourself for them. They're uncomfortable when you overextend. They actively encourage you to say no, to take care of yourself, to prioritize your own needs. They care about your well-being, not just your usefulness. And being in relationship with people who value your authenticity more than your accommodation, that's transformative. It teaches you that you're lovable not despite having boundaries but because of them, that being real is more attractive than being accommodating, that the right people don't want you to disappear inside the relationship. As you begin to understand your people-pleasing pattern, as you see its origins and its costs, it's easy to turn judgment on yourself, to think, why did I let this happen for so long? Why didn't I see it sooner? Why was I so weak? But here's what's important to remember. You weren't weak. You were adaptive. You developed this pattern because at some point in your life, it served you. It kept you safe, or kept you loved, or helped you survive something that would have been harder without it. The work now isn't to punish yourself for coping the way you knew how. The work is to develop compassion for the part of you that learned to disappear, to understand that it was doing its best, and to gently, carefully, lovingly teach it that there are other ways to be safe now. Self-compassion is crucial for healing people-pleasing patterns because shame only reinforces the cycle. When you judge yourself harshly for people-pleasing, when you call yourself weak or pathetic or too sensitive, you're perpetuating the same self-abandonment that created the pattern. You're continuing to treat yourself as unworthy, as needing to be better before you deserve compassion. But self-compassion offers a different approach. You were doing your best with the tools and understanding you had. Your people-pleasing was adaptive, intelligent even, a creative solution to a difficult problem. And now you're learning new tools, developing new patterns, because the old ones aren't serving you anymore. Psychologist Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion identifies 3 elements: self-kindness instead of self-judgment, common humanity instead of isolation, and mindfulness instead of over-identification. For people-pleasers, practicing self-kindness means talking to yourself the way you'd talk to a friend who's struggling with the same pattern. You'd offer understanding, patience, encouragement. You wouldn't berate them for taking so long to change or for still struggling with old patterns. Extend that same kindness to yourself. Recognize that change is hard, that you're doing challenging work, that setbacks are part of the process, not evidence of failure. Common humanity means recognizing that people-pleasing isn't a unique personal failing. It's a widespread pattern, especially among people who experienced childhood adversity, who received conditional love, who grew up in environments where their needs weren't consistently met. Understanding that your pattern is shared, that it's a common human response to specific conditions, reduces shame. You're not uniquely broken or weak. You're having a normal response to abnormal circumstances, and many people struggle with the same patterns, the same difficulty saying no, the same fear of disappointing others, the same tendency towards self-abandonment. Mindfulness means being aware of your experience without becoming overwhelmed by it. When you notice you've people-pleased, when you realize you said yes when you meant no, instead of spiraling into shame and self-criticism, practice simple observation. I noticed I people-pleased just then. That's interesting. That's the old pattern showing up. It makes sense given my history. This gentle noticing creates space between the pattern and your identity. You have people-pleasing patterns, but you're not a people-pleaser as an essential, unchangeable identity. The pattern is something you do, not something you are, which means it's something you can learn to do differently. Part of self-compassion is understanding the younger you who developed this pattern. Imagine that child or adolescent navigating relationships that felt unsafe or unpredictable, doing whatever they could to earn love or avoid pain. Feel compassion for how hard they tried, how much they adapted, how creative they were in finding ways to cope. That younger you deserves appreciation, not criticism. They did what they needed to do to survive, and now you, the adult, can take over. You can protect that younger part. You can reassure them that it's safe enough now to have boundaries, that you'll handle the consequences of saying no, that they don't have to keep accommodating anymore because you've got this. Self-compassion also means allowing yourself to struggle, to not be perfect at changing your patterns. You will slip back into people-pleasing sometimes. You will say yes when you mean no. You will accommodate when you know you should set a boundary. This is normal. Change isn't linear. Old patterns have deep grooves and you'll fall into them occasionally, especially under stress. When this happens, self-compassion means not using it as evidence that you're failing or that change is impossible. It means recognizing it as part of the process, being gentle with yourself, and trying again. Each time you notice the pattern and choose differently, even if that's not every time, you're making progress. And gradually, through repeated self-compassion, something shifts. You internalize a kinder voice. The harsh inner critic that used to dominate begins to quiet. You develop a relationship with yourself that's characterized by understanding rather than judgment, by patience rather than pressure, by appreciation for how far you've come rather than criticism for how far you still have to go. And that internal kindness becomes the foundation for external boundaries, because when you treat yourself with compassion, you naturally begin to protect yourself, to honor your limits, to prioritize your well-being. Self-compassion and boundary setting aren't separate processes, they're intertwined, each reinforcing the other, together creating the conditions for authentic self-honoring. Learning who you are after years of being whoever others needed is a process of reconstruction. You have to go back and find the parts of yourself you buried, the preferences you ignored, the dreams you postponed, the voice you silenced. You have to ask yourself questions you haven't asked in years. What do I actually enjoy? What makes me feel alive? What do I want my life to look like when I'm not organizing it around other people's expectations? And at first the answers might not come easily. You might have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of having spent so long reading other people that you forgot how to read yourself. But gradually, quietly, your authentic self begins to emerge, like something that's been waiting patiently in the dark for you to finally turn on the light. The reconstruction of self is delicate work. You're not just adding new skills or changing behaviors, you're recovering something fundamental, the core of who you are beneath all the adaptations and accommodations. This requires patience because the process can't be rushed. Your authentic self has been buried for years, maybe decades. It won't emerge immediately just because you've decided to stop people-pleasing. It needs time, space, gentle encouragement to unfold. Start by creating space for self-exploration. Time alone, without distractions or obligations, where you can simply be with yourself. This might feel uncomfortable initially. People-pleasers often avoid being alone because solitude brings them face to face with the emptiness they've been running from, the lack of clear identity, the uncertainty about who they are. But this discomfort is the beginning of discovery. Sit with it. Let yourself be bored. Let your mind wander. Notice what thoughts arise when you're not focused on others' needs. Notice what you're drawn to when no one's watching or judging. Experiment with preferences. Try different things. Not to become good at them or impress anyone, but simply to discover what resonates. Try foods you've never eaten. Listen to music genres you've avoided. Read books outside your usual interests. Take different routes to familiar places. Notice what you enjoy, what energizes you, what feels right in a way you can't quite explain. These small discoveries start to build a map of your authentic self, revealing preferences that are genuinely yours rather than adopted from others. Revisit childhood interests. Before you learned to people-please, before you started shaping yourself to fit others' expectations, what did you love? What activities absorbed you so completely you lost track of time? What made you curious? Sometimes our authentic self is most accessible in childhood, before we learn to suppress it. Going back to those early interests can reconnect you with parts of yourself that have been dormant. Maybe you loved drawing but stopped because it seemed impractical. Maybe you loved being in nature but had no time. Maybe you loved writing or building things or dancing. Consider reviving those interests, not professionally, but purely for the joy of reconnecting with that part of yourself. Practice having opinions. Start small. Have an opinion about movies, food, music. Notice your actual response rather than reading the room for what opinion would be acceptable. Practice voicing your opinion, even when it differs from others. Practice disagreeing, first in low-stakes situations, then gradually in more significant ones. Having and expressing opinions is fundamental to having a self. If you're always deferring to others' perspectives, you can't develop your own. Give yourself permission to be wrong, to change your mind, to have strong reactions. Your opinions are yours. They don't have to be right or popular, they just have to be honest. Notice your values. What actually matters to you? Not what you think should matter, not what matters to people you admire, but what you genuinely care about. When you feel anger or joy or passion, pay attention. These strong emotions point toward your values. What injustices upset you? What achievements bring you pride? What losses would devastate you? Your values are compass points helping you navigate toward your authentic self. When you live according to your values, even when it's difficult, you feel aligned. When you violate your values to please others, you feel the dissonance people pleasers know so well. Reconstruct your dreams. You had dreams once before you learned that your job was to support others' dreams. What did you want for your life? What excited you? What felt possible before you decided it was selfish or impractical? Some of those dreams might not fit anymore, and that's okay. But some might still resonate, might still hold energy, might still be pointing you toward your authentic path. Consider what you'd do if you had permission, if other people's expectations and needs didn't factor in. That vision, however unrealistic it might feel, contains information about your authentic self. The reconstruction of self is ongoing. You don't arrive at a final authentic identity and stay there. People evolve, but what changes is that you're now evolving according to your own internal guidance rather than external pressure. You're becoming more yourself over time rather than becoming whatever others need. And that ongoing process of self-discovery, that commitment to honoring your unfolding self, that's freedom. That's what you were moving toward all along, even when you didn't know it. That's what's possible on the other side of people-pleasing. There comes a point in the journey of recovering from people-pleasing when you realize something profound. You don't have to earn your worth. You don't have to prove your value through constant service. You don't have to make yourself useful to deserve love, rest, space, existence. You are enough simply because you are. Not because of what you do, not because of how you help, not because of your ability to accommodate or please or make everything easier for everyone else. Just because you're here, just because you're human, just because you exist. And when that truth finally lands, not just intellectually, but in your bones, in your nervous system, in the deepest part of yourself, everything changes. You discover that boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges. That saying no to what depletes you creates space for what nourishes you. That the people who truly love you don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be real. This realization of inherent worth is radical, especially for people pleasers who've spent their lives believing worth must be earned. You've operated from the assumption that your value is conditional, that you must continuously prove you deserve love, care, consideration. That if you stop being useful, people will leave. That your existence is justified only by your contribution to others' well-being. But this belief was always false. A distortion created by early experiences that taught you love was conditional when love should have been freely given. The truth, the simple, profound truth, is that you have inherent worth. You were born worthy. You didn't have to do anything to deserve care and love and respect. You didn't have to earn the right to take up space, to have needs, to exist as you are. These things were your birthright simply by virtue of being human. And everything you've done to earn worth, all the accommodating and pleasing and self-sacrificing, none of that added to your value, because your value was never in question. You were always enough. You just weren't taught that, weren't shown that, weren't treated like that was true. So you developed elaborate strategies to earn what should have been freely given. Understanding that you're inherently worthy doesn't erase the years of conditioning that taught you otherwise. Your nervous system still believes your worth is conditional, still sounds alarms when you set boundaries, still fears that being yourself will result in abandonment. But knowing intellectually that you're inherently worthy is the beginning. From that knowing, you can start to challenge the old beliefs, to question the assumptions that drive your people-pleasing, to experiment with boundaries and discover that your worth remains intact even when you're not accommodating. The freedom in enough is the freedom to rest, to stop striving, performing, proving, to simply be without justifying your existence through usefulness. This doesn't mean you stop caring about others or contributing to their lives. It means you care and contribute from choice rather than compulsion, from abundance rather than fear, from genuine desire rather than desperate need to prove you deserve to exist. When you know you're already enough, helping others becomes a gift you choose to give rather than a payment extracted to earn your worth. The freedom in enough is also the freedom to be imperfect. You don't have to be perfect anymore because your worth doesn't depend on perfection. You can be messy, uncertain, struggling, human, and your value remains constant. You can make mistakes, have bad days, be less than your best, and you're still worthy of love, care, rest. This is radically different from the performance you've been giving, where any imperfection felt like evidence of inadequacy. Now you can be human without apologizing for it. The freedom in enough means boundaries become natural. When you know you're inherently worthy, protecting yourself doesn't feel selfish. It feels necessary. Setting limits isn't depriving others of what they deserve, it's honoring what you deserve, which is to exist within sustainable parameters, to have needs that matter, to protect your own well-being. Boundaries become acts of self-respect rather than acts of selfishness. And from that place of self-respect, you can engage with others more authentically because you're not accommodating from fear, but choosing connection from wholeness. The freedom in enough also transforms your relationships. When you're not desperately earning worth through pleasing, you can engage with others from a place of security rather than insecurity. You can let people see you truly, imperfections and all, because their acceptance or rejection doesn't determine your worth. You already know you're worthy. Their opinion is just their opinion, not a fact about your value. This allows for real intimacy, the kind that's only possible when you're not performing, when you're simply being yourself and trusting that's enough. Because it is enough. It always was enough. And slowly, through living as if you're inherently worthy even when your nervous system doesn't fully believe it yet, through setting boundaries and surviving, through being imperfect and still being loved, through choosing yourself and discovering that the right people stay, slowly you begin to feel what you've known intellectually. The belief begins to settle into your body, into your nervous system, into the deep core of you. You are enough. You always were. You don't have to earn it. You can simply be. And that simple being, that authentic existing without constant justification, that's what freedom feels like. That's what it means to finally come home to yourself after years of abandoning yourself to earn the right to stay. And so you've travelled through this landscape tonight, through the quiet territory of people-pleasing, through the pattern that shaped so much of your life, through the accommodations and silences and yeses that meant no. You've looked at the origins of your pattern, the way it developed from early experiences, from lessons learned too young about what was required to stay safe, to stay loved, to survive in relationships that didn't always hold you the way you needed to be held. You've seen the cost, the exhaustion, and resentment and loss of self that accumulated over years of prioritizing everyone but yourself. And you've glimpsed the possibility of something different. A life where your needs matter, where boundaries are honored, where you're loved for being yourself rather than for disappearing into whatever others need. This pattern you've carried, this people-pleasing that's shaped how you move through the world, it's not a flaw, it's not weakness. It's adaptation, intelligence, a creative solution to a difficult problem. You learned to please because it served you once, because it kept you safe or earned you connection, or helped you navigate relationships that would have been harder without this strategy. You did what you needed to do with the tools and understanding you had. And there's no shame in that. There's only recognition, awareness, the gentle acknowledgement that what worked then isn't serving you anymore, that you're ready now to learn different patterns, to develop new ways of being in relationship that honour yourself as much as others. The journey from people-pleasing to authentic self-honouring is not quick or easy. Old patterns have deep roots. Your nervous system will continue pulling you toward accommodation, even as you work to change. You'll still say yes sometimes when you mean no. You'll still suppress your needs in moments of stress. You'll still fear disappointing others, still worry about being too much or not enough. These pulls toward old patterns don't mean you're failing. They mean you're human, doing difficult work, rewiring decades of conditioning. And each time you notice the old pattern arising and choose differently, even if not perfectly, even if not every time, you're making progress. You're teaching yourself something new. You're proving that change is possible. And as you continue this work, as you practice boundaries and self-compassion and authentic self-expression, you're not just changing your behaviour, you're reclaiming yourself. The parts of you that learn to hide are beginning to emerge. The voice that learned to stay silent is starting to speak. The needs that learn to stay small are beginning to matter. You're becoming more yourself, more solid, more real. And this self, The authentic you beneath the accommodating persona, this self is worthy exactly as it is. Not because of what you do or how you help or your usefulness to others, but simply because you exist, simply because you're here, simply because you're human, complex, real. You're not broken, you're not too much or too little, you're not selfish for having boundaries or needing rest or choosing yourself sometimes. You're human, doing your best, learning and growing, becoming more aligned with your truth. Your voice matters, your needs matter, you matter, not conditionally, not based on performance or perfection or how accommodating you can be. You matter inherently, fundamentally, simply by being alive. And the people who truly love you, the relationships worth having, those don't require you to disappear. They want you present, authentic, boundaried. They want the real you, not the version that never says no. And tonight, as you settle into rest, you can let all of this soften. You can release the effort of trying to be everything to everyone. You can set down the weight you've been carrying, the responsibility for everyone else's feelings, the constant monitoring and accommodating and self-suppressing. Just for tonight, just for these hours of sleep, you can simply be. You don't have to be useful. You don't have to be available. You don't have to prove anything or earn anything or accommodate anyone. You can just exist, breathing, resting, taking up exactly the space you take up without apology. Let yourself drift now. Let the thoughts about what you should have said or could have done differently fade into the background. Let the worry about disappointing someone, about whether you've been good enough. Let all of that dissolve like mist in morning light. You've done enough for today. You've been enough. You are enough. And you can rest now, knowing that your worth isn't going anywhere, that you'll still be valuable in the morning, that you're allowed to close your eyes and let go and trust that everything will be okay. You're safe here. You're held. You can rest. Just breathe. Just let yourself soften into sleep. You're exactly where you need to be. Everything else can wait until morning. For now, just rest. Just be. You're okay. Everything is okay. You can sleep now. Let yourself go. Let yourself rest.